right. As a rabbi, we've already looked at how Jesus used exaggeration. We've looked at several examples of it, but he also used Hebrew idioms. An idiom is a cultural phrase that only makes sense in that culture. English also has its own idioms. Here's one. It's raining cats and dogs. Now, you understand perfectly what I mean when I say that. I don't have to explain it to you at all. But try translating that into another language. Or say that in a different English-speaking culture, and they will look at you like you're nuts. What does that mean? How can it rain cats and dogs? I looked up English idioms because it's fun just to see all the crazy things we say without realizing it. Here's a few more. Tickled to death. Shooting from the hip. On the tip of my tongue. Beating around the bush. Kicked the bucket. Barking up the wrong tree. Like taking candy from a baby. Penny for your thoughts. Foot the bill. Those are some fun things that make absolutely no sense when you really try to explain them, but we all understand perfectly what they mean, don't we? Every language has its own idioms, and the Hebrew is no exception. And some of the idioms actually that they used in the Bible are still in use today. This should not be surprising to anyone, but one of their idioms actually comes from Scripture. Proverbs, to be exact. Proverbs 22 verse 9 states, "A good eye will himself be blessed, for he shares his food with the poor." Now, if you look up that Bible verse, most translations will translate it a generous person because they understand that's the thought behind it, but it literally states a good eye. According to the Bible, a good eye is someone who shares his food with the poor. Pair that with another verse. In Proverbs 28, verse 22 says, "A man with an evil eye hastens after wealth." Well, the Jewish people read Scripture, and they memorized it, meditated on it, and they loved to link Bible passages. And they went, wait a minute, here's one with a good eye, here's one with an evil eye. And they're both saying opposite things. A good eye must be someone who's generous. And a bad eye or evil eye is a stingy person. A good eye sees the need of those around him or her and is willing to help. An evil eye or bad eye sees only himself and thinks only of himself. And that became an idiom in that culture that is still in use today. And we read it in the Bible. Matthew 6, Jesus states this, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." That whole section right there is talking about the love of God versus the love of money. The context itself should have made it obvious. But most people don't realize what Jesus means right there when he says, if your eye is good. And so through the centuries, you can read, they have come up with crazy ways to try to figure out what Jesus was saying. Anything from an optometrist came along and said, well, it literally is an eye, and here's all the problems that can happen with it, to the Gnostic saying, well, it's an inner third eye that's hidden, and it gives you special knowledge. But if you look at the culture, what Jesus is saying makes perfect sense. He's talking about generosity. In other words, Jesus is saying, if you're a generous person who loves God more than money, your life will be filled with light and you will be overflowing. But if money is your master, you will be filled with darkness and emptiness. The same idiom is actually used in Matthew chapter 20, verse 15. The context is at the end of a parable. Now, the parable is a landowner goes out first thing in the morning and grabs a group of men and says, I need you to work in my vineyard, and he agrees on a certain payment. He's a fair owner. He's going to pay them a day's work. Well, he goes back out a couple hours later and grabs more men. A couple hours later, grabs more. A couple hours later, he goes out 1 hour before the end of the workday, grabs a few more men, brings them into his vineyard, and they work. When the 12-hour day is over, he grabs all his workers that he's hired throughout the day, and he pays them all the exact same wage. How do you think the men who are hired first respond? They don't like it. Wait a minute. We were hired first. We have worked the heat of the day. We have put in 12 hours for you, and you have paid these guys who've worked 1 hour the same? You can kind of appreciate where they're coming from. But the owner responds, what's your problem? I paid you what we agreed on. He's not being stingy with them. I paid you a full day's wage. You're getting what you earned. And then in the Bible, he says this in the Greek, what does it say? Is your eye bad because I'm generous? Most translations will translate it, are you envious because I am generous? Is your eye evil because I am good? That's what he says. What Jesus is actually saying is that idiom, but most translators recognize what Jesus means, and so they translate it, are you envious because I am generous? Throughout his life, Jesus called his disciples to be generous, to have a good eye. In other words, to see the need of those around them and help. We are to be like our Father in heaven who has an incredibly good eye. Because doesn't he always see our needs? And isn't he always quick to help? Having a good eye shows the world what your God is like. But generosity affects more than just money, doesn't it? Because we can be stingy with our time, with our homes, with any number of resources that God has given to us. When was the last time you volunteered to help in the nursery? And I sincerely appreciate you. Or what about teaching a Sunday school class? Or babysitting for a mom who's going crazy? Or called a friend who's struggling to take her out for coffee? Or wrote a note to someone who's sick to let them know you're praying for them? There are many ways to be generous, and we have so many resources available to us with which we can be generous. In all honesty, the most generous people I have met are generous with all of their resources. They give until it hurts, some of them, but not only of their money, with their time, their food, their listening ear, their prayers, their affections. They are generous to the core, and God shines through these people. We can all picture someone who's stingy, can't we? Not just with their money, but with every part of their life. Have you heard the story of Scrooge? A very wealthy man, very frugal, and a very poor, unhappy man. He was a miser, not just with his money, but with his heart, with his affections, with his time. Scrooge is an appropriate picture of an evil eye. Don't be like Scrooge. Be generous with your time, your food, your affections, and even your money. Being generous with money is a huge place to begin. And honestly, I think it's the litmus test for how generous we'll be with the rest of our life. But generosity is more than just about our finances. But how you handle your money usually shows how the rest of your life will go, doesn't it? The rabbis believe that everything you own is from God, and you're simply a steward of His resources. None of it belongs actually to you. Your responsibility is to manage it wisely until the owner requires it again. And wouldn't it be easier to be generous with our resources if that's really how we looked at it? God, you want me to put an extra 20 to this ministry? It's your money, not mine. That's where you want it. God, you want me to spend an hour helping my friend clean out their basement even though I have 20 other things I could do? It's your time, not mine, if that's how you want it spent. We need to have a good eye and bring the kingdom of heaven to earth as we share with others as our King shares with us. Money can be a touchy subject, and I understand. Trust me, I like knowing we have more than enough money to pay our bills, buy the food that we need to feed our children, to keep them happy, and even a lot of our wants are met. I am very, very thankful for that, and it is hard to think about giving away hard-earned money. I get that. But I don't think it's a suggestion. I think it is a requirement that God has for His children, that we are to be generous. But I will leave that between you and God. That's not my place to push. So I'm going to jump off that subject and get to another touchy subject. Because money isn't the only place where we can struggle with generosity, especially as women. We need to learn to be generous in how we view people. Have you ever heard the phrase, do not judge? It actually is a statement Jesus makes, and it comes from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 7, verse 1. Jesus says, do not judge, for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. People drive me crazy with this phrase. I will be honest. They love to throw this phrase out. Anytime, as a Christian, you will come along and say something's a sin, they will come back with, don't judge me. I have seen it on Facebook. I have seen it on billboards. I have heard it in conversations. Don't judge me. It drives me crazy. So we're going to talk about it tonight. Because what was Jesus actually saying when he said, don't judge me? Was Jesus saying, you're wrong if you tell someone else they're wrong? Was that what he meant by do not judge? And what does that have to do with generosity? Well, good questions. First, we have to understand what judging others meant in a first century Jewish context. 100 years before Jesus, so this is pre-Jesus, another rabbi made this statement: judge each person with the scales weighted in their favor. Now, the picture he was creating was of a marketplace, and you would bring your money to the shopkeeper, and you would say, I have this much money, and I need to buy wheat. And so the shopkeeper would take your money, and he'd count it out, and then he'd grab a weight equaling your amount of money, and he'd put it on the scale. And then he would pour out wheat on the opposite side until the two sides balanced. Now, a generous shopkeeper, a kind shopkeeper, would add a little extra wheat to give you a little bit more than you paid for. He'd weigh the scales in your favor. Weighing the scales in someone's favor is essentially saying, give the benefit of the doubt. Imagine the best possible motive for the person who just irritated you. Don't judge them. That coworker who was snippy with you today, maybe she just learned her first grandchild had just been miscarried. Or maybe she was up all night with a sick kid and was absolutely exhausted. Maybe your boss didn't mean to be so harsh when they talked to you today, but maybe they just spent an hour on the phone with an unhappy customer and then instantly got off and had to talk to you about something. Or maybe your boss is trying to quit caffeine and has a massive headache and honestly didn't realize how snippy he sounded. Being generous in our views of people. Give them the benefit of the doubt when they make us angry or just plain irritate us. That's what Jesus is talking about when he says, do not judge. I actually read recently of a group. It's a Jewish group actually, and they come together once a week. And the purpose of this group is for everybody to bring forward all the ways they were irritated by people earlier in the week. And then as a group, they would group think different possibilities, best possible scenarios as to why that person irritated you, so that they would help to deal with anger and learn how to give people better motives and not judge the other person. When someone irritates us or makes us angry and we judge in that context, we are condemning them. Essentially, we're saying, I know your heart. I know why you did what you did. You had no good reason to upset me. I know everything that's going on. I have found you to be guilty. That's judging. A few years ago, I went through this really dumb phase, and I don't even know how I got into this habit, where somebody would ask me a question, and I would stop to think, but I would not even acknowledge I had heard the question. And I would stand there thinking for so long through my answer. Maybe I was exhausted. I'll just chalk it up to being a mom. I was just tired. And the person would walk away because I hadn't even responded to them. And thankfully, it only happened a few times before I went, okay, I have to stop. I have to at least acknowledge it. I heard you. I'm thinking. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be rude. And I actually went up to one lady, and I don't remember who it was. It was several years ago. I do not remember who I did this to. So if you're in this room, I apologize. But I remember I went up to one lady and said, I'm so sorry. I did that to you last week. I didn't mean to. I was thinking. I just wasn't thinking fast enough. And all I remember, she said this, that's all right. I figured you were just tired and had something else on your mind. She didn't judge me. She gave the best possible explanation for why I treated her rudely. And I appreciated it. So what does this mean for sin? Is pointing out sin a part of judging? Jesus was talking about judging in the sense of condemnation, not discernment. Jesus never meant to ignore sin or wrongdoing. The Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, is full of commands to warn your fellow brother or sister when you see them in sin. This is not talking about a person's actions. This is talking about their hearts and their motives. And even when you talk to someone who's struggling with a sin, you can even talk to them differently. Instead of saying, you're wrong, this is stupid. Hey, I understand you're struggling. I get your marriage is hard right now, and that guy looks really good. But I'm worried for you because I know we're all human and we all fail. Even the way you talk to someone about their sin can come from a heart of love instead of a heart of judgment. But you can still talk to them about their sin, can't you? I once heard a Bible teacher years ago talking about other Bible teachers that he disagreed with in a very specific area of Scripture. And this is how he talked about them. They love the Lord. They're doing what they think is right. I just don't think they've got it in this specific area. He was very uplifting in his comments about these other Bible teachers, even though he disagreed with them a lot. Instead of judging your fellow brother or sister harshly, have a good eye towards them. Weigh the scales in their favor. You don't have to ignore the sin that's being committed. That's not what's being talked about. It's okay to acknowledge sin. But take a breath before you assume their heart and their motives. Maybe that girl at the mall who's wearing incredibly tight clothes is desperate to know she matters and that somebody cares and she has worth. Maybe that coworker who's constantly making small remarks to tear you down actually feels intimidated by you and thinks you're better than she is. Have a good eye. Be generous both with your money and with your opinions of others. The motives you ascribe to others may one day be the motives God ascribes to your actions. How do you want to be judged? Be generous in every area of your life as your Father in heaven is generous. That's the end of that topic. Take a deep breath. I really could not think of a good transition, so this is my transition sentence. We're changing topics. My husband would shoot me if he heard that. So, what? Yeah, it's an idiom. Yeah, yes, that is an idiom. Yes, he would not shoot me. He'd probably roll his eyes. That is not an idiom. He probably would. All right. Every year since we were first married, Brian and I have celebrated Passover. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, Passover is the celebration of God's redeeming Israel out of Egypt. The very first Passover took place thousands of years ago when the angel of death went from house to house, killing the firstborn son. And we have to talk about this for a minute. Because I have heard too many times people that hate the Old Testament because they see it as full of a God who's angry and wrath and out for blood and violence. And I have to tell you, that hurts my heart because I love the Old Testament. Don't tell my mom, but it's actually my favorite. Yeah, you probably do. Partially, I think, because I love a good story. And the Old Testament is an amazing story. The Old Testament is full of a God who is merciful and gracious. It's not about a God who's angry and full of wrath and vengeance, but it's about a hero rescuing a damsel in distress, about a God who is so in love with his people that he is going to remove anything that comes between him and his beloved. I love the God I have come to see in the Old Testament. He amazes me. So I'm going to help you. If you're one of those people, let me help you tonight with this specific story. Because it's easy to say, oh, how cruel of God to come along and kill these firstborn sons. What did they do? You have to see it from a different perspective. In Exodus 4:22, God says to Pharaoh through Moses, Israel is my firstborn son. So just as Pharaoh is stubbornly holding on to God's firstborn son, God finally decrees he will take Pharaoh's firstborn son. And you have to remember, God has given Pharaoh 9 other chances to let Israel go, hasn't he? Pharaoh even says more than once, I get it, you can get out of here. Haha, just kidding, never mind. He is incredibly hard-hearted and foolish. This is the last and final plague out of 10 that God sends on Egypt. May we be wiser than Pharaoh and not need 10 reasons to obey. So Pharaoh is incredibly stubborn and hard-hearted, and through 9 different plagues, God shows him time and time again, let my son go. And Pharaoh says, nope, he's mine. Till finally God says, enough. You will let my people go. And he goes for the jugular. God knows exactly what it will take to get his people free. And he does it. So he takes the firstborn son of Pharaoh. And because of the community aspect of their culture, Pharaoh represents the entire nation. So as goes the leader, goes the community. We don't appreciate the community aspect of the Middle East. We are so individualistic in our society. But the Middle East is very, very community focused. And they honestly would not have struggled with this like we do. To them, it would make sense. Well, yeah, if Pharaoh got disciplined because he disobeyed, so does the community. So every Egyptian must suffer the same fate. No man is an island. Every man is interconnected with those around him, especially the leader. And go figure, God's plan works. After losing their firstborn sons, Pharaoh and all of Egypt rush Israel out of the country. Leave now before we're all destroyed, they say. But it's not just every Egyptian household that will face the angel of death. Even the Israelite households will as well. But God tells Israel, here's how you deal with this. In Exodus 12, God says, take 1-year-old males without defect. You may take them from the sheep or the goats. And on the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel will slaughter them at twilight. They're to take some of the blood, put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over fire, along with bitter herbs, bread made without yeast. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. You're leaving in the morning. They were also commanded by God to continue celebrating this event that same night every year through all generations. Kill a lamb, eat the meat, eat unleavened bread, and bitter herbs. Let me ask you a question. Does that mean even today? I think so. I think so. God never said you can stop. I think there's continue to do it today. Every year, they are to reenact the initial Passover. Through all generations, Israel is to remember how God came to set his people free. Just an interesting little tidbit here. They don't normally eat lamb anymore. They no longer have a temple in which to sacrifice. God says through Moses, you are to sacrifice on the place I choose. And God chose the land of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, on a very specific mountain where the temple was set. Well, the temple's gone, so they can't sacrifice anymore. They realize that. So instead, when they celebrate Passover, they do chicken or fish, some other type of meat. They no longer do lamb until the temple's rebuilt. We'll see what God does. But they have continued celebrating Passover through the generations and through the centuries. Did you know that the Last Supper Jesus and his disciples ate was actually Passover? Now, this to me is exciting because it gives us a lot of insight into what Jesus and the disciples did during that supper. The Jewish people have kept great notes over the centuries of how they celebrate and what they do. And they haven't really changed much with Passover. They've added a lot to it, but they haven't really taken anything away. During the Passover, they would praise God for his redemption of Israel in the Exodus. They would recount amazing signs and wonders God had done. During the Passover meal, Jesus would remind the disciples and himself of God's faithfulness, God's plan, God's love, God's covenant, God's promises. And the celebration would last for hours. It starts at sunset and easily goes 3 hours or more. There's actually a story told of 2 rabbis who got together with their disciples, a big group, to celebrate Passover. And the rabbis were enjoying it so much and staying up so late, the disciples eventually went, "We're tired, we're going to bed." And they left and went to bed. When the disciples got up in the morning, they found their 2 rabbis still sitting there at the table celebrating Passover. It was a chance for an all-night party if you wanted one. My husband likens Passover this way. Think of the food of Thanksgiving, the excitement of Christmas, and the timing of New Year's Eve. They will spend weeks preparing for this. There can be singing and dancing, tons of food, 4 glasses of wine, and it happens at night. Now, no, we don't do wine with our Passover meals. If you've celebrated with us, we do sparkling grape juice. So, I don't like wine. I know some of you do. I don't see anything wrong with it. I personally don't like wine. Now, sorry if I said something. Neither Brian nor I were brought up celebrating Passover. And I will say, no, I do not think you're sinning if you never celebrate Passover. I do not think you are less spiritual if you never celebrate Passover, or if you celebrate it once and have no desire to celebrate it again. That's fine. That is perfectly fine. I will put a plug in, though. I think it's a great thing to do at least once, just to experience it. To me, it brought that Last Supper to life, like I had never seen it before. Part of the reason we continue to celebrate Passover is for the sake of our kids. I love that one night every year, our kids get to physically get involved in the Bible story, because Passover involves all 5 of your senses, if you've ever celebrated it. It's a great way to make the Bible come to life for kids and adults. And on top of that, every year, I usually learn something new, or something new hits me about Passover. Normally, we celebrate with groups, because truthfully, it's a lot easier on me if we celebrate with a big group. But one year, we decided just to celebrate it as a family. And at this point, I only had 3 little ones. And our meal was not elaborate. I am not a good cook. But I spent all day in the kitchen trying to create a meal. And then, so my kitchen's a mess, and then I have to sit at the table with 3 little ones and keep them quiet, entertained while we do the liturgy of Passover. And no, we did not do 3 hours, and we didn't do the full service. We did a very short and condensed version with a lot of breaks so they could get up and move. We did a lot of singing and let them dance. And I kind of understand now, Jewish people give their kids wine during the Passover, and I get it. I don't, because I was in there, okay, I would like a little wine tonight. You know, I was done. But we didn't. We did sparkling grape juice, which they loved. But it was exhausting. It was absolutely exhausting. And then when we're finally done, we had to put the kids to bed, and then I had this whole kitchen that was filthy. And thankfully, I have an amazing husband who helps in the kitchen. And so we worked on it together. But when the kitchen was finally clean, I was done. Don't talk to me. Don't touch me. I want to go to bed, or I want to put on a movie, put my feet up, grab a book, whatever. I am done with today. We have never done it alone again. And now that I say that, God may make me do it alone again. But with more children. Oh. But it was a good experience, but it was a hard experience. Think how you feel after Thanksgiving or the end of Christmas. After you've eaten all that food and you've had all that excitement, you're tired. You're exhausted. You just want to veg, turn on a movie, grab a book, go to bed, whatever. Well, imagine with me for a minute that you're one of the disciples, And you've just celebrated Passover. You've had your 4 glasses of wine, this huge meal. It's late, and you're following your rabbi out to a garden where you're thinking you're going to spend the night to go to bed. And you're passing houses where some are still lit, but a lot are dark. People are going to bed. Remember that? It will be important next week when we talk. And finally, you get to the garden, and you get to shut your eyes. And then Jesus says, hey, I need you to pray with me. Oh, Jesus, it's late. I'm tired. Do you remember those 4 glasses of wine? I'm a little lightheaded right now. I'm just going to be honest with you. Tell me, how easy would it have been to stay awake at that moment? Especially since, you may have picked up Jesus was doing some strange things, saying some unusual things, but you really have no clue what the next few hours hold. As far as you know, you'll sleep tonight. Tomorrow you'll get up. Jesus will go back to the temple, do some more miracles, some more teaching, debating with people, please the crowds. It's going to be a normal day as far as you're concerned. And so these disciples who truly do love their rabbi fall asleep after he specifically asks them to stay awake. In their culture, that's huge. You can appreciate Jesus' disappointment in his disciples. I, your rabbi, asked you to stay awake and pray with me. And as disciples, it was their responsibility to do whatever their rabbi asked. But you can also hear Jesus' compassion, can't you? He says to them, the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. I love that. Jesus understands our failures, our frailties, our struggles. He didn't pounce on the disciples. He didn't shame them into obedience. He gently, lovingly rebuked them. He acknowledged the struggle is real. He's a good God. I cannot imagine being the disciples that night, the exhaustion, the complete lack of understanding of what was coming. They're tired. They probably did shut their eyes to really pray and fell asleep. And they left their rabbi to pray that night alone. Now they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is a very appropriate place for what's about to happen. The Garden of Gethsemane is an olive garden where they make olive oil. And the way you make olive oil is you take olives, you gather them together, put them in like a basin, you take huge rocks and you crush, you press the olives as hard as you can to get all the oil out of the olive. So in this garden where things are pressed, the Son of the living God gets pressed. But what comes out of him is blood. You can appreciate Jesus' very human desire to have his closest friends stay awake with him and encourage and support him through their prayers. He is horrified at what's to come. He doesn't want to be alone. But his beloved disciples fall asleep. But how good is the Father that he sends an angel who gives him strength and comfort as he pours out his heart in prayer. And finally, it's done. He's ready. Jesus walks to the disciples with a firm step, a desire he will see this through to the end, and he begins to wake up his disciples. You can imagine their surprise and fear as they're waking up out of a deep sleep, and all of a sudden they see this crowd of people coming towards them with torches. And we're used to crowds of people seeking us, but it's kind of late at night to be seeking Jesus, and this crowd has soldiers in it. That's not normal. And but Judas is with them. It's okay, but what's Judas doing? And they watch in unaccountable horror as one of their own walks over to their master, kisses him on the cheek. Greetings, Rabbi. It always seemed a little weird to me that Judas had to point out which one was Jesus. But finally it hit me, they don't have pictures. They don't have cell phones. They don't have Facebook, Twitter, the internet. They can't post Jesus' face on everything. And according to John, at least some of these soldiers were Romans. So they probably weren't in the temple listening to the visiting rabbi preach. They could have cared less. As far as they were concerned, this is just another zealot. They all look alike after a while. Who cared what he looked like? And then don't forget, it's pitch black. There are no houses with lights. There are no street lights. Judas' group had torches with them, but how much light do torches really give? And there are at least 11 other men with Jesus, potentially more that night as well. So there could have been a small crowd starting to wake up and mill around. It would have been easy in the darkness and the confusion to grab the wrong person and let the main guy escape. So Judas says, tell you what, pay me. I'll find a time when you can arrest Jesus when no one's around, no crowd will cause you trouble, and I'll make sure you get the right guy. The question has been asked, why did Judas betray Jesus? No one knows. But the fact that a disciple would betray his or her rabbi is almost unheard of. This is unthinkable. Was Judas disappointed, secretly hoping that Jesus would initiate a revolt against Rome and set Israel free? And since it became obvious Jesus was not planning on starting a rebellion anytime soon, maybe Judas decided to push Jesus a little bit and force it to happen. Was Judas on the lookout for a quick buck and he would sell his grandmother if the price was right? I doubt that one, but maybe. Was Judas angry at Jesus? We don't know. But I wonder if the answer is a little bit simpler than all of that. The Gospels tell us that Judas was stealing money from the treasury. Now, when you join a rabbi and his disciples, you become a family. The rabbi, in essence, becomes your father, and the other disciples become your brothers. So Judas was stealing from his family, betraying Jesus every time he took money out of that community pot, because that money was to go to feed the whole group. I wonder if Judas simply set himself up. The Bible acknowledges that Satan entered into Judas, so he was obviously deceived, but I don't think he was controlled. I think over the years, Judas bit by bit betrayed Jesus in little way after little way after little way, so that when that big moment came, the decision had already been made. Be careful with the small things. They can influence the big things a lot more than we realize. What's that statement? A lot of small decisions add up to one big one. Either way, for whatever reason, Judas betrays Jesus. The disciples' worst nightmare begins. The Romans have arrested their rabbi, their master. They are terrified for themselves, their families, and their teacher. They have seen what the Romans are capable of. Whole cities have been wiped out, children murdered, wives taken, men put on crosses or tortured in prison for years. Who knows what's about to happen? They are filled with fear and terror. So they leave. They leave the rabbi they have followed for 3 years. They leave the man who is able to calm the seas, to make the blind to see and the lame to walk and the deaf to hear. They leave the man who is able to raise the dead. These 11 men turned and fled into the night. What is going on? What is God doing? Come back next week and find out. Would you all please pray with me?